Welcome to the Economics of Me podcast. This is the 9th episode of the Economics of Me podcast, your place for making sense of the economics of everyday life. Born out of my own learning, our mission is to simplify concepts, economics and business, bringing it all back to first principles and what it means to you. And as we're telling stories, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wangal people of the Darug Nation, on which I'm recording this podcast. The Wangal people have been telling stories for over a millennia, and I'm committed to treading lightly on these lands as we move forward to a future of reconciliation. Today, we are revisiting tariffs. It's been a whirlwind month to say the least in the US, as the Trump administration has put in place and then revoked, then increased and then reduced tariffs across a multitude of countries. In our previous episode on tariffs, we explored what they are, their history, and also the impacts that they can have on an economy, rippling through the cost of goods and increasing inflation. So what we'll try to do today is to give a snapshot on what the lay of the land is, also appreciating that this is an extremely fluid situation. Without adding to the commentary, and there's plenty, what I'll try to do is to give a broad brush view on the state of play, but to also explore a few key themes that need to be expanded on. We'll explore why this could mark the end of the current world order and upend long-standing trade agreements, how this will ultimately impact the American consumer and economy, and why the notion of this golden age of American manufacturing is nothing but a nostalgic pipe dream. We'll also look at how this will reshape trade routes and why China is set to gain the most from the US's protectionist stance. Today, on the 9th episode of the Economics of Me podcast, we'll revisit tariffs. Let's dive in. So here's where we stand right now. The US has maintained a 10% baseline tariff on all imports, which kicked off on April 5th. And on top of that, there are 25% tariffs on steel, aluminium, auto, and auto parts that have been active since mid-March and early April, respectively. Meanwhile, the sweeping reciprocal tariffs announced on Liberation Day in Trump speak in early April, ranging from 11% to 50% on more than 75 countries, are paused for 90 days, except for China. That exemption means that Chinese imports still face steep duties. And speaking of China, the US tariff on Chinese goods is at 145%, a level reached earlier this month, which Beijing matched with 125% duties on American exports. There are some glimmers of de-escalation, but it's hard to work through all of the bluster. And so despite this acrimony, there are a few signs of breaking. On April 25th, China exempted certain US-made pharmaceuticals from its 125% counter tariffs, and a leaked list suggests that up to 131 product categories from vaccines to jet engines may be eyed for also similar relief. On the US side, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has signaled the administration's views that the status quo is untenable, hinting at more negotiations with Canada, Japan, South Korea, and others in the coming weeks. And back on US soil, legal fireworks are also flying. On April 23, 12 Democratic attorney generals filed suit in the US Court of International Trade, arguing that the president lacks authority to impose these sweeping levies without Congress, calling them unlawful taxes that disrupt the economy. Joined by states from New York to Arizona, they're challenging not just the 10% baseline, but the higher duties on China and other nations, setting up a constitutional showdown that could drag on for well beyond the 90-day pause. At the same time, we've seen conflicting signals on actual trade talks. President Trump claimed in an interview that he'd been in direct contact with Xi Jinping and that over 200 deals were near completion. Yet, Beijing has flatly denied any consultations are happening. This discord has left global markets jittery. Investors have rallied modestly on the hopes of de-escalation, but economists warn that this uncertainty and the substantial increases in consumer prices could linger longer after any headlines. And then we have the supply chain impacts. hedge fund veteran Bill Ackman recently pointed out that the real damage may be permanent. Companies are already shifting supply chains from China to places like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, and won't come back. That cake is baked, as Ackman put it. Even if tariffs ease, rebuilding those networks won't be swift or cheap, and it could reshape global trade for years. So what does this all mean, and where to from here? So on April 5th, 2025, or Liberation Day, the White House rolled out its reciprocal tariff plan, a flat 10% duty on every foreign import into the United States, immediately followed by matching levies equal to those imposed by trading partners. So in effect, India faces 26%, the EU 20%, Japan 25%, while China endures a staggering 145% rate. Financial markets cringed, and analysts at Rabobank calculated that this yields a 29% weighted average tariff, the highest since the 1930s Smoot-Hawley era during the Great Depression. Why such drastic measures? At its core, this is a strategic gamble to onshore critical industries and reclaim national security. As Trump put it at the Rose Garden, we can't rely on foreign shipyards or factories if conflict arises. Economists warn that this isn't just blunt protectionism. It's a targeted assault on the post-war order that the US architected, aiming to basically force allies and rivals alike into fresh negotiations on everything from semiconductors to pipelines. Businesses are reacting fast. Giants like Procter & Gamble, Hermes and Hasbro are planning price hikes to offset duties, while automakers such as Hyundai weigh shifting assembly from Mexico to Alabama to dodge these steep tariffs. These moves signal a broader decoupling from China, with supply networks fragmenting towards Vietnam, India, and even reshoring back to the US, redrawing investment flows that once centered on low-cost hubs. So now we have alliances under strain. Across the Atlantic, Brussels has held off on retaliation and even proposed scrapping all industrial and goods duties in exchange for US concession, only to find lukewarm interest. Meanwhile, in the Indo-Pacific, New Zealand and Australia are quietly huddling with Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia and EU officials to shore up free trade ties against a backdrop of rising US tariffs. And meanwhile, across the largest shared land border with Canada, after decades of deep cooperation, Washington slapped a 25% tariff on most Canadian exports, and even a 10% duty on oil, prompting Ottawa to retaliate with its own 25% duties on $30 billion of US goods. That tit-for-tat move risks turning allies into adversaries. And second, US refiners that rely on Canadian crude now face costly infrastructure changes or higher input prices, costs that experts warn will trickle down into high gasoline prices for American drivers. And finally, the proposed 25% tariff on Canadian softwood timber is already sending timber futures into a 2.5-year high, making construction materials and home projects noticeably more expensive. What will likely emerge is not simply a stronger America, but a fractured world. 1. Regional blocs gain clout, so Asia's ASEAN, Europe will look to revamp its other bilateral pacts. 2. Supply chain corridors bypass traditional routes, spurring new infrastructure and digital customs. And 3. Diplomatic leverage shifts. Tariffs become tools of foreign policy and not just revenue measures. For countries and companies alike, the era of universal free trade is over. We're witnessing the birth of a multipolar trade ecosystem where power and profit flows to the nimblest negotiators. And so this may be some of the outcomes, but what about American manufacturing? Why won't President Trump's new big tariffs actually bring manufacturing jobs back? The administration promises a manufacturing renaissance, but the numbers tell a different story. Goldman Sachs calculates that a broad-based 10-point increase in US tariffs would add about 100,000 jobs in protected industries, but they'd cost roughly 500,000 jobs elsewhere, and that's a net loss of 400,000 positions overall. And Yale's Budget Lab estimates that tariffs could boost US unemployment by 0.6 percentage points, wiping up 770,000 jobs by the end of 2025. And even if tariffs did create openings, the US simply doesn't have the workers ready to fill them. Take steel. After imposing higher duties, companies in Arkansas scrambled to hire locals. But faced with crippling labour and housing shortages, many skilled workers were nowhere to be found. And more broadly, 1.4 million manufacturing roles already went unfilled during the pandemic, and experts project up to 2.1 million more jobs could remain vacant by 2030 due to skills gaps, and this is by the US Census. And so tariffs are essentially a tax on imports. So every widget, component, or raw material that's covered gets more expensive. And that raises production costs for US factories using foreign parts and forces them to pass on these higher prices onto consumers. Business Insider warns that we'll see empty shelves and steep price hikes on everyday, low-margin goods and those items that Americans actually want to buy in big volumes. You have to remember that in the past few decades, America's growth has centered on high-margin sectors like software, aerospace, and advanced pharmaceuticals, and not on low-margin assembly work. Those industries pay really well and attract top talent, and benefit from automation and innovation. And tariffs on imported low-margin goods won't rebuild a workforce that's moved upstream. They'll just squeeze consumers and pressure businesses that rely on international supply chains. Given this talk about trade, we need to look deeper into how this could play out with China. And here's a twist. China might actually benefit. Because the US didn't isolate China, it targeted almost everyone, and that's Canada, the EU, Japan, India, and Australia, for example. And so suddenly global companies are watching the US turn inward and unreliable. And in that vacuum, China's stepping in. And here's where it gets interesting. China is already offering tariff exemptions on key American goods like pharmaceuticals and aviation parts. And it's quietly lowering tariffs on the EU, ASEAN, and Latin America. That's not just diplomacy, it's smart business. As the US alienates allies, China is repositioning itself as the more stable trade partner. Countries that once looked to Washington are now negotiating with Beijing, and that includes major deals with Brazil, the African Union, and the expanded roles of the Asia-Pacific mega-trade bloc. China's message? We're open for business, even if America isn't. You'd think that US tariffs would scare companies away from China, but the reality is complicated. While some low-end manufacturing is moving to Vietnam and India, China is doubling down on high-value production. So think of semiconductors, EVs, and green tech. And plus, it still controls huge parts of the supply chain for electronics, rare earths, and solar panels. And so even when companies leave China, they often end up in Chinese-owned factories in Southeast Asia. Think you're avoiding China? Think again. America's loss is China's soft power game. And while the US tariffs push up costs for American consumers, China uses this moment to flex its influence by investing in infrastructure through the Belt and Road, deepening ties with the Global South, and promoting the yuan as the alternative trade currency. All of this boosts China's long-term strategic leverage. It's not just about trade, it's about trust, reliability, and global leadership. What does this do to Middle America and the American consumer? As we explored in the first tariff episode, let's be clear. A tariff is basically a tax on imports. So let's explore how this starts to hurt the hip pocket. So take automobiles. On April the 2nd, the administration slapped a 25% tariff on all imported cars and auto parts. And now even US assembled vehicles often use parts from overseas. That extra costs on transmissions, on electronics, on tyres, they get folded into your monthly car payment or the price you pay at the dealership. Analysts project that average vehicle prices could jump by as much as $3,000 to $5,000 in the next year alone, and that's squeezing middle-class budgets that are already stretched thin. And next, let's talk medicine. A recent Reuters Commission report warns a 25% tariff on pharmaceutical imports could raise US drug spending by $51 billion annually. And that's up to a 12.9% bump on your prescription costs. And so for families managing chronic conditions or parents are filling asthma inhalers, that's not a small uptick. It's the difference between filling a prescription or skipping a dose. And now, what about building materials? Middle America builds and renovates constantly, from barn repairs to backyard decks. And although the US-Mexico-Canada agreement shields some wood products, global reciprocal tariffs still hit key materials like steel fasteners and roofing and specialty timber from Europe and Asia. And the result? Timber futures jumped, and home improvement chains have quietly raised prices by 5 to 10% in recent weeks. And that's turning a simple DIY weekend into a costly affair. All this adds up to a confidence crisis, and in late April, the Conference Board reported that the US consumer confidence plunged to its lowest level in nearly 5 years, citing inflation and tariff fears as the key drivers, and that's lower than during the COVID pandemic. When people start tightening their belts, skipping family outings or delaying car purchases, or putting off home upgrades, the ripple effects hit every corner of the economy. When people spend less, demand drops, companies produce less, and people lose jobs. Some have argued that this is one of the most seismic changes in the global order in recent times. And while it's an incredibly fluid situation, early signs of pain and a new world order are already emerging. I guess the question is, how long can we all endure? Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time. And if you've enjoyed this episode and feel compelled to subscribe, that would help our little channel. In the next episode, we'll look at treasury bonds and continuing on our US economics series. We'll explore how this informs the economics of your everyday life. You can find the Economics of Me podcast anywhere you listen to your podcasts.